The next panel is starting now. So it is titled Advocacy, Legislative and Corporate Wins and Insights. And we hope that the majority of you will be able to stay on throughout the remainder of the conference. Thank you so much again. And I'm turning it over to my fabulous teammate, Julia. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you, Sofika, and thank you, Lasse. It was really interesting to hear all the insights that you provided us. And well, I'm really excited to sort of officially start our very first panel of this year's Aquatic Life Conference. Is a packed session, so brace yourself. We have some very interesting conversations ahead of us. So my name is Julia, and I'm the Global Policy Lead here at Aquatic Life Institute. I want to welcome everyone that is joining us live, as well as the people that are catching up on the recording of this session. Just before introducing the panel and our wonderful panelists, let me just remind the audience of some housekeeping items, which are very important for us at Aquatic Life Institute. You will notice that audiences are muted upon entry and the camera is off. You can post all the questions that you have in the Q&A box. We will aim to answer all the questions that you post at the end of all the different presentations. As mentioned already, all the sessions are being recorded, so no worries. If you miss part of the discussion, you can always catch back up. And as mentioned already by Sofika, we have an absolute policy of zero tolerance for any type of harassment or discrimination. So we really ask your help to engage in respectful and productive discussions. As mentioned already, this is a very packed session. We have 90 minutes ahead of us and several amazing speakers, as well as plenty of Q&A time at the end. To properly introduce the session, this panel is called Advocacy, Legislative and Corporate Wins and Insights. So we will be hearing from advocates on their triumphs and insights on navigating the very diverse legislative landscapes, as well as securing corporate victories. This all to highlight the power of effective advocacy in driving meaningful change for aquatic animals. So very briefly, I will introduce all the speakers in the order that they will be speaking, but I will let them sort of tell you what they do in their daily job. So we have Krzysztof Wojtas from Compassion Inward Farming, Claudia Milla from Equalia, Lorenzo Fruscella from Animal Law Italia, Amanda Fox from Animal Rights Initiative, Sagar Shah from Rethink Priorities, Jane Bush from Crustacean Compassion, and our very own Cecilia Valenza from Aquatic Life Institute. So before I jump into other conversations, Krzysztof, I'm just going to leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Let me just quickly share my screen. And hopefully it's working.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for the introduction and for the invitation. Great to be on the panel and be able to share some of my thoughts with you and be with such inspiring people on the panel. I'm going to briefly talk about our work on fish policy that we do at Compassion, focused on EU policy specifically. As Compassion, we work both on corporate engagement and political advocacy, and today, obviously, I'm going to focus specifically on the latter and sort of why we chosen to focus on the EU specifically. So, our project started over 6 years ago, and when me and my team started working on Compassion on fish topic, we did quite in-depth analysis of what would be the best approach to go on with our work. And we've been analyzing different approaches, and we decided to put main efforts on the EU specifically. There's not dismissing in-country work. We could talk about that later. We do actually, because Compassion is an international organization, we have country offices across Europe. So we do specific in-country work, but we try to sort of bring it together at the EU level. And why did we choose specifically to work at the EU level and, well, in general, work in Europe on fish? There are a few reasons. The main ones are that there is already existing animal welfare legislation, or there was already existing animal welfare legislation at that time. And technically, it was already applying to fish. In practice, fish were completely not included. But the legislation was affecting all vertebrate animals, so therefore technically fish as well. So we thought this is something we can sort of grab to. There were European Food and Safety Authority opinions on fish welfare, which we thought is a good sort of starting point for the discussion. So there was already a setting where we thought, okay, we have an opening here. Moreover, the European public is quite supportive towards animal welfare. We know that from different polls, the Eurobarometer poll, but also together with Eurogroup for Animals, we did several years ago quite a comprehensive survey, 9,000 people across 9 European countries, to test specifically for fish and how people see fish, what they think about possible fish legislation. And there was quite a big support. So we thought, okay, this is a good sign. We have a sort of take up here. And another important thing is, if you work at the EU level, obviously if successful, you're influencing not just one country, but 27 member states, which is obviously a big win. And there is something so-called the Brussels effect. So if you get a change at the EU level, there is a chance it's going to spread across countries outside of the EU because of the important sort of how important the EU is in terms of trade and policies and so on. So we decided, there's a lot to win here. There is something to grab on, and there are certain sort of tools we could use to get momentum here. So even if we get a small change, it will have quite a big effect, hopefully. That was our approach here. And technically, if you compare Europe to some Asian regions or Asian countries, there's not that much fish in Europe, but still it's over or around, we think, up to 1.2 billion fish, so a significant number. And obviously, there is this cumulative effect of how we can sort of transition the narrative around fish welfare in general. We have quite a comprehensive political strategy, I believe. I'm not going to go into detail, but I guess I could sum it up with the fact that we're trying to, on one hand, work as much as possible with institutions, mainly the Commission, but not just Commission, also the Parliament, also at member state level, sort of being constructive and pushing there with lobbying, with working through advisory councils, working with MEPs, sending parliamentary questions and so on, but also at the same time putting public pressure to sort of raise the profile of the issue. And here are just a few examples. We did an exhibition in the European Parliament and quite a prestigious place at the European Parliament to sort of show, to really introduce people, the MEPs, the Commission, to the topic of fish welfare, and we got really quite an uptake on this one. The picture below is one of our events where we bring together people from the Commission, experts in the field. We try to present, what we're asking for, the legislation, the welfare improvements, humane slaughter are feasible, can be applied. There are people who are already doing it. There are experts who can explain it. So we're basically trying to be constructive. And at the same time, we're trying to raise the profile of the issue by doing undercover investigations. We did quite a few of those in the past. The picture you can see here is from a farm in Greece where we filmed a few years ago. We're doing in-country campaigning work as well. The poster you can see, the street poster, is actually from Czech Republic, where we've been doing a specific action around carp. And the picture below is us handing our petition to the Commission specifically. And with this approach, over the past few years, I believe we had few victories. And just to make clear, by saying we, I don't specifically mean Compassion, because there's so many other amazing groups working on the political front. Just to name a few, Eurogroup for Animals, Aquatic Life Institute, groups who are sort of working at the EU level, but also many groups working in the member states, but with the strategy sort of with an aim of influencing the EU. So Equalia, sorry, Animal, you have plenty of those. So I think it's a group effort. But just to give you a few examples of sort of where we moved as a movement, I remember when we've been starting, and I've been starting working on fish, it was almost 10 years ago, and I've been meeting with some officials. And when we were doing our first meeting at the commission, people were rolling their eyes on fish welfare. What the hell are you talking about? What do you need fish welfare? To a point where now we really have meaningful conversations. And just to name a few, we managed to get official commission-supported fish welfare guidelines through the Animal Welfare Platform, which were translated into 23 languages and disseminated by the EU Commission. We got EU Sustainable Aquaculture Guidelines, which is something that the EU produces to guide its development in aquaculture, to include a whole fish welfare section. We managed to get fish welfare included in the definition of sustainable aquaculture, which maybe doesn't seem like a big deal, but actually it is, because then every time at the EU level we talk about sustainability, the welfare aspect can be brought into it, and that's helping to sort of embed fish welfare in much wider discussions. We managed to get a European Parliament study on fish welfare, which also advised or basically highlighted that a welfare legislation is needed. We managed to get a commission to set a fish welfare reference center, to give mandates to EFSA, so the European Food Safety Authority, to give the mandate to produce species-specific welfare opinions on fish, and not just fish. Actually, one of the opinions scheduled will be about cephalopod and crustaceans. So we can see, the topic being treated more and more seriously, and we're building ground for something bigger. And the biggest thing, I guess, I have to mention is the Commission has set themselves a target of revising existing animal welfare legislation and improving it. We've been working quite hard on that, not just on fish. I mean, with compassion specifically on this revision. As a fish team, we've been working with the Commission and trying to get fish really included in that. From unofficial sources, I think we've been quite successful with that, and even officially the Commission said it will be using the Animal Welfare Platform guidelines and the Sustainable Aquaculture guidelines as a basis, plus a lot of sort of expert advisory that we managed to sort of give to the Commission as well. I'm not having a separate slide on this because we know at the moment the revision is in quite a difficult spot because of the political situation. We're not sure whether it's going to be successful. But my point is, even if if the revision is successful, it's a major win. But even if it's not, my point is, I think we're having a pretty nice progression considering where we started. As I said, I think we've been starting from a point zero with no recognition or very little recognition of fish welfare, and now at the political level, it is becoming a topic. And my last point would be on general progress, and I think we're probably going to be discussing this in the panel, is that I think whatever work we do, it's actually quite complementary. My experience from the political advocacy is that actually it's not just about political advocacy, it's helping the corporate engagement quite a bit as well. So my recognition, going back to this element of like how there was very little understanding and people were not treating fish welfare seriously just a few years ago, I can see that with industry representatives who are also present at the EU. There are associations and different lobby groups from farmers, from aquaculture, and they are definitely seeing us there. They're seeing this is a legitimate political topic, not just activists, making videos about fish sentience, but actually it's a political topic that can result in action. So they are definitely going in sort of much more serious into the topic, which I think is helping on many sort of levels. And the very last thing, just sort of an advertisement for me from anyone who would want to work on the EU policy or even in-country policy. I highly recommend the Rethink Priorities report written by Neil Dallaghan, which is a roadmap for working on farmed fish policy in the EU, but also member state level. I think basically as a movement, we could probably take this document as sort of guidance for all of us to coordinate. And there is actually coordination going around this document. So we could probably mention that in the panel. That would be it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Krzysztof. And I totally relate when you were talking about some of these policy wins that might sound like not such a big deal, but they are. So I totally resonate with you. We know that policy is a long-term sort of effort that we have to endure in. And yeah, those things that we managed, as you say, as a collective force to achieve are pretty impressive. So I'm excited to talk more about this in the panel, but for the sake of time, I just want to give the floor to Claudia straight away, and we'll jump into the discussion later. So Claudia, over to you.
Thanks, Julia. Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. Just bear with me one moment. And I'll go full screen. Okay, so please let me know if you can see it, which you should.
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much to the Aquatic Life Institute for inviting us. It's an honor. It's a truly honor to be part of this panel. Thanks, Krzysztof, for that presentation. Actually, you touch upon many things I'm about to say, so I feel bear with me if I repeat some information, some terms. I'm Claudia from Equalia, and I'll give you a briefing today on our corporate and institutional work. So let's begin. Here you have an index. We will share these slides afterwards, so I won't spend much time describing it for whoever is interested in reviewing the presentation. About us, we are a Spanish-based animal welfare organization focused on achieving a food system free of intensive factory farming. Our mission aims to reach corporate and institutional agreements to end farm animal suffering. And here you can see the 4 lovely people that make the fish welfare department. We have Miriam, our supervisor, Jesus, our institutional fish welfare specialist, Juan, our corporate fish welfare specialist, and me, who am the fish welfare specialist. So next slide. What do? We do many things. As everyone in each organization, we try our best to help fish the best way we can, but we focused on 3 lines of work. We had the corporate outreach, institutional outreach, and citizen awareness. When it comes to corporate, we establish relationships with fish producing companies and retailers to reach animal welfare commitments. Regarding institutional, we are alongside other key stakeholders from the Spanish aquaculture sector, elaborating a series of scientific-based species-specific guidelines for farm fish welfare in Spain. And also when it comes to citizen awareness, and this resonates so much to what Krzysztof just said regarding how he has seen the improvement and how when the first time he approached MEPs or he approached someone at the EU level and he said fish welfare, they said, what? So we do need to show people that when it comes to animal welfare, aquatic animals have every right to be included, and they are sentient beings, and they have short and long-term memory, and they are very intelligent. So we try our best to share through different social media channels, different posts talking about fish welfare. Okay. Now, for the EU legal framework, I won't spend much time here because, again, as Krzysztof was saying, we are also aware that the EU has been reviewing all the animal welfare legislation for the past 2.5, almost 3 years. Just to give you an idea, you can see here showing in white what is legally binding and then showing in gray what is not. So basically, at the end of the day, we need a much more robust legal framework. The one that we have already in place, it doesn't really protect farm fish. It gives some very general information, but not very specific regarding how fish welfare can actually be protected at the EU level, at any national level regarding or relating any member state. So we hope that the EU is gonna come with some conclusion at the end of this year, and hopefully they will do something regarding fish welfare. They already said that DG Sante was gonna work regarding stunning and slaughter, so we'll see what are their plans for the legal framework, which really needs to be improved. Okay, and now I will stop a little bit more in this slide and the next two slides. So regarding farm fish stunning, this is one of our very, very top priorities. It has been our priority from the very beginning, since we began working on farm fish welfare a couple of years ago. Our aims, we want to redefine the standards, we want to reach commitments, or to reach agreements, better said, with the companies, and we also want these companies not to only sign the commitment, which is great, but to actually implement it, to do something to show willingness to implement stunning for the fish that are reared and then slaughtered in Spain. Here you have a short version of the commitment. We want these companies, and when we say companies, we mean producers, processors, and retailers. We want them to recognize that fish are sentient beings and announce, depending on the species, that by 2025, 100% of fresh and frozen trout, or by 2027, fresh and frozen sea bass and sea bream marketed in Spain, they will be effectively stunned before slaughter. What do we mean when we say this? We mean that right now in Spain, and it happens, we are in a similar situation in other Mediterranean countries, France, Italy, Greece, Turkey. Most of the time, when you had the fish at the farm and they are about to be slaughtered, so they are taken out of the cage or the tank, and they are directly put in a container with a mix of ice with water, and they are left there to die. And it can take up to 20 or 30 minutes for them to die, which is very, very painful, which is extremely stressful for these animals. So we want to take a step back and to be sure that something is done in order to minimize the suffering to very, very minimal level, or to reduce it at the very minimal level. So if we stun the fish, and that means that they lose consciousness within 1 second and then they are slaughtered right after the stunning, that means that the amount of suffering that they are going to experience actually decreases significantly. So we are trying our best to get companies operating in Spain, not only Spanish companies, but international companies operating here, to sign the commitment and actually to implement it. Simultaneously, we commissioned a report to the Animal Welfare Education Center, which is a startup from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And the objective, the aim of this report is to check the feasibility of implementing stunning in farm sea bass and sea bream in Spain. These are two of the top 3 species that we have in Spain. The third one would be rainbow trout. And we plan to launch it, if everything goes well, we'll have it finished before the end of this year. And we want to launch it at 2 levels. At the EU level, in DG Mare or DG Sante, and also at the national level in collaboration with the Spanish Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, which is MAPA. And also, I need to say something before moving to the slide, because we have been working with the companies and trying to show them how important it is that they do something. Some of them show some willingness, others are not really convinced. We have now decided to take a more active approach, and we are planning to launch a campaign to show them some images and to show them why they need to do something regarding stunning, just to add some additional pressure on the pressure that we are already having when we have these conversations with them. So you'll hear about the campaign within the next few weeks. Now, regarding the farm fish welfare guides, this is, well, we are not being very humble here because we added the sentence for Luis Polar, but we are very, very proud to be part of this project. And we wanted to show here this sentence from him saying that fish welfare is also finally rising to the surface. Canada, the Netherlands, Norway, and Spain adopted the world's first national guidelines on fish welfare. Here you can see the volume number 1, the general volume, which was published by the end of October last year. And this is the first one of a series of species-specific volumes. This year, we are working on one for sea bass and another one for sea bream, which hopefully they will be ready by the end of this year or early in 2024. We'll share, as soon as we have them, we'll share them with you. Also, I'd like to point out that this work is a collaboration between different stakeholders. We have representatives from APROMAR, which is the Spanish Aquaculture Business Association. We also have people from the Spanish Ministry of Aquaculture, Fisheries and Food who check the content and then validate the content of these guides. We also have different animal welfare organizations, Compassion World Farming and Equalia, top scientists, experts on fish welfare, representatives from the companies that produce the most volume when it comes to sea bass, sea bream, rainbow trout, and turbot. So you can see we have different key stakeholders working together to produce these guides. Finally, this was actually already published in the EU Aquaculture Assistance Mechanism website, and we hope we also shared with DG Mare. I was going to say DG Sante, no, we sent it to DG Mare, and hopefully this will also be used, as Krzysztof was mentioning before, regarding the other bits and pieces, the other documents that were already published. When the EU wants to do something regarding fish welfare, we offer them this document to be sure they have here all the updated, the latest scientific knowledge regarding fish welfare in Spain, so they can use it, and we hopefully, fingers crossed, they will. And finally, we are currently collaborating with other animal welfare organizations operating in France, Italy, Spain, Greece, and Turkey. This is an informal working group. We have Well Farm from France, Serie Animali from Italy, Compassion World Farming, which is from the UK, but they also operate in Spain, the Hellenic Animal Welfare Federation, and Future for Fish, the Hellenic, of course, from Greece, and then Future for Fish in Turkey. So we realized, first we began just to exchange, to share some information, and we realized that we had many things in common. European aquaculture is clearly dominated by Norwegian and British salmon. We, as Mediterranean countries, we share the same finfish species and rare systems, and also the corporate outreach work was very similar, because when we checked, for instance, a few months ago, the companies, the top companies for retailers and fish producing companies, we could see some similarities. So it made total sense to try to find some common ground here, to work together and to see how we can actually reach our goals, because at the end of the day, maybe we had different slightly approaches, but we want to achieve more or less the same when it's fish welfare. So we are working to see how we can get there. And with this, I finish my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention, and looking forward to hear the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Claudia. I absolutely echo what you said regarding the importance of involving a variety of different stakeholders. And I think from your presentation, from the different types of engagements that you guys carry out, but also the different products, let's say, that you managed to produce, I think it shows how effective it is to bring others into the conversations. And let me go back to what Sofika was saying at the opening. It's a difficult topic, so it's required that we bring all the actors on stage. So thank you for sharing this. I think there's already some questions for you, but we will answer all of them at the end. So Lorenzo, I will just give the floor directly to you in the sake of time.
Thank you, Julia. Let me just share my screen. Which hopefully you can all see. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. For people who don't know who we are, Animal Law Italia is an Italian NGO whose mission is to advance the legal protection of animals in Italy. We aim to build a society where the needs, the interests, and the dignity excuse me, of animals are recognized and taken into account by the law. And today I'd like to tell you all really what we've been up to these past 6 months, working on the legal protection of decapod crustaceans. And I'll be telling you all why it matters and specifically what we are doing about it. So let's get started. These images are probably very evocative, unfortunately, for most of us, if not all of us. This is the main way that lobsters are killed. It is estimated that it takes between 2.5 and 3 minutes for a lobster to die while being boiled alive, which causes, as you can imagine, substantial suffering However, being boiled alive is only one way that these animals are being treated. Just like lobsters are only one group within the larger order of Decapoda, which comprises most species of shrimp, prawns, crabs, of course, lobsters, as well as spiny lobsters. And over 15,000 species grouped in over 2,700 genera. These crustaceans are the ones that are most fished around the world, and the fisheries of these animals is increasing worldwide at a rate of 4.5% every year. And as a consequence, these are also the animals most eaten and used for food around the world. The sheer number of animals used as food is really worrying, as it's being proven that by science that these animals are sentient and therefore can feel suffering and pain, as summarized by the report by the London School of Economics and Political Science 2 years ago, which told us again that these animals are sentient, and for this reason they were included in the Animal Welfare Act of the UK recently. However, while we know that these animals are sentient, they keep being treated in ways that maximize their suffering and cause substantial amounts of pain. These animals often lose their limbs where they're being captured, or they have their limbs detached, their claws detached from them in a practice known as declawing. They're often stored or transported in very high densities with their claws tied, often outside of the water for aquatic species, and to finally be slaughtered in ways that cause a lot of pain, such as being boiled alive, as I told you earlier, but also simply being dismembered alive. And this is where we come in. Our campaign, Dalla parte dei crostacei, on behalf of Crustacean, by our organization, aims to amend the law. We want to change the law so that these animals are treated as sentient beings and not just as objects. We want to introduce binding guidelines that protect them in all stages of their production. And finally, we want to ensure that these rules are being applied, not only in the fishery phase, but also from restaurateurs and in markets. We launched this campaign 6 months ago, and so far we have around 6,500 signatures. And we are partnering. We have several partners partnering with several institutions, of course, the Aquatic Life Institute, but also several other NGOs such as Crustacean Compassion, academia, University of Messina in Italy, as well as Eurofish Market, an Italian company, which is helping us to delve deeper into the issue to find out how these animals are being treated within the industry, behind the scenes, how these animals are being handled and killed by the industry, which hasn't been done before to our knowledge. We have so far produced 3 documents, our policy requests and recommendations, the minimum standards for the protection of these animals, and finally, this last report, only available in Italian for now, I'm afraid. It was published last month, and here we detail the legal status of decapods in several countries around the world. It's a pretty thorough piece of work, 80 pages, over 100 citations, and we made sure to analyze several countries around the world, some within Europe and some outside of Europe. However, if you don't speak Italian, no worries, because the translated shortened version is coming soon to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. And this is just a map, an overview to show you what the situation is like in the countries we've analyzed. You go from countries such as Switzerland and New Zealand, they have the general norms, but also very detailed rules, stringent rules, to some that have only general rules, such as Norway and Austria, to some countries such as Australia and Italy, where the situation is a bit more complex. Only parts of the country have rules that protect these animals. And first, I'd like to show you to delve into the regulations in Switzerland and New Zealand to then talk about Italy, situation in Italy, which can be proven useful. So in Switzerland, the regulations apply to lobsters, crabs, and some shrimp species, and here it's prohibited to transport these animals on ice and to keep them outside of the water. It's also mandatory to stun these animals before slaughter, which effectively prevents these animals from being boiled alive. There are only some slaughter methods permitted, depending, of course, on animal group in this case. And this is very important. The staff has to be trained, so they have to undergo examinations that proves that they know how to handle these animals and to slaughter them while minimizing their pain. Similarly, in New Zealand, these regulations apply only to some animals, but most dagopods that are important for commercial purposes, such as crabs, lobsters, and kora, which is a local species of freshwater crayfish. And here you have three accepted methods for killing these animals after stunning them, and which means that also here it's prohibited to boil them alive, for example. And if these tools are not available, there are two methods that are permitted, and they offer quite specific information regarding this. So for crabs, you can only kill them in certain ways, such as to spike them in their nerve centers. While for the crays, you have to cut them. This is again to minimize their suffering in all the ways possible. The regulations in Italy are a bit more complex. The national regulation is missing in Italy. However, you have 46 animal welfare regulations that we know of scattered around several municipalities around Italy. They can get very specific, so offering specifications on tank size, water parameters, storage conditions, the way they're killed, they should be killed, slaughtered. But at the same time, they can vary substantially from municipality to municipality. This is a map, for example, to show you the situation in Emilia-Romagna, a region in the north of Italy. And you can see there are several little towns or cities that offer these regulations. However, they can vary substantially, even between towns that are only a few kilometers or miles apart. And this is problematic, as you can imagine, because it's very confusing, and we're not really sure how implementable these regulations are, and whether they're being implemented at all. It is therefore necessary to establish a national regulation in Italy to protect these animals at all stages of production. This would ensure that these animals are treated in ways that minimize their pain, and they wouldn't only be confined to some municipalities and towns, but they would actually be protected in the whole territory, all around Italy in the same way. We are hopeful, however, not only because of the regulations that are already in place in many parts of in many municipalities, but also because there were two precedents that were set in the past few years. Once in Florence and once in Milan, restaurateurs were found to be keeping live lobsters on ice, and the judge in both cases, both instances, deemed this to be illegal. This is very important to us because it tells us that there are rules that are being challenged, and there is scientific support that's being followed, showing that these animals suffer, and the law is adapting slowly to the fact that these animals can suffer, and which makes these precedents highly valuable for us. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time. If you want to like to find more about our campaign, feel free to scan the QR code, go to our website, or for any personal inquiries, feel free to contact me directly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo, for this sort of summary and overview of your project. And I'll just add that if you want to dive more deep into Animal Law Italia's project, I also had the chance to interview Lorenzo for about half an hour just a month ago. So you can find the recording on our website or on LinkedIn. So if you're curious to know more, I also suggest checking that out.
That's right. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll just move on to our next panelist, because I just want to make sure that we have time for Q&As, as we're already getting quite a few of those in the box. So Amanda from Animal Rights Initiative, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Well, I just want to start out by saying thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And this is really important to me. And I'm just so thankful for everyone that's already spoken. Especially the last presentation was so impactful, moving, and really touched me. So thank you so much for your work. So I will share my screen with you all and just share my presentation. So I'm Amanda Fox from Animal Rights Initiative. We started in 2017 as a street style form of activism, but in 2019 decided to shift our focus onto more of legislative actions to create more, visible change for animals, because we just didn't feel like protesting was enough. And so we have had a lot of bills successfully go through the Washington State Legislature, fur farming, bills to protect animals that are used in the circus and animals that are used for testing and cosmetics. We decided to also introduce octopus protection. And so, as you all know, industrialized, systematically cruel farming operations have emerged in Spain, and there are research facilities that operate in Mexico and recently in Hawaii. And so we believe it's the responsibility of all of us to set a precedent for these animals by protecting them from cruel mistreatment with the law. So the existing octopus farms are, well, currently there is the one that's operating in Mexico, and then recently there was an investigation to what appeared to be a sort of petting zoo farm in Hawaii, but they were actually performing fatal breeding experiments on day octopus that they were taking from like the wild. So they misrepresent themselves as a research facility, but haven't published any research. And the owner has told everyone that he plans to sell the research to food operating facilities or possibly other industries that will be able to sell their bodies. They're not successful yet and have been shut down, but I know that they are trying to reopen. And so for the initiative so far that we have in the United States, we do have the bill that was introduced this last session in Washington. And it was the first bill in the world that we know of to protect octopus to pass a formal committee. That bill will go up again this year for an entire House vote because this is part of a biennium, so they're just continuing the process this year. The bill is sponsored by Representative Strom Peterson and basically prevents any form of octopus factory farming in Washington State or in Washington water. In this upcoming legislative session, a mirrored bill was going to be introduced by Representative Luke Efslin. So this is going to prevent octopus factory farming for food inland or in Hawaii waters. And hopefully can prevent the research facility from reopening. So I just wanted to talk about how accessible it is for everyone to be able to lobby, even if you're just a regular citizen, even if you're not part of a group. Everybody can get started with lobbying just by representing themselves as concerned citizens, but also work in cooperation with existing groups. So if you want to work on legislation in your state or your local municipality, I would recommend just gathering existing legislation that has already been introduced to give to your local legislators as a sample. So when you approach them, you can say, look, this is already in action in multiple places. So you can use our bills that have been introduced in Washington as a really easy example. And when you're approaching them, you don't have to only approach your representative. If group, you can ask every single legislator that there is available to introduce them and just say, this is the problem and this is the solution offered by the bill with the examples of the bill. I would personally recommend targeting legislators that have already previously introduced animal bills or environmentally friendly bills. And then when you're lobbying with them, like when you're just asking them to be the prime sponsor, see if you can get a meeting, because most politicians are willing to meet for about 15 to 30 minutes, and you can take up a lot of time with them really explaining the issue, and you can get any number of us that are on this call to be in the lobbying session with you, just to back up any claims that you have if you don't feel like you're an expert. So if possible, my call to action would be for everyone to contact the Hawaii and Washington state representatives. They are going to be the next ones that vote on this actual issue. And that's going to be coming up here just in January. So you can start emailing them now to get them like familiar with the issue, but especially once the session starts in January. We've been told by them specifically that the more times they see that bill in the headline of the email, that they're more likely to pass it or look more into it. And then something else that's really effective, if you haven't heard of it already, is to submit a letter to the editor to your local newspapers. So it's usually a very brief, like less than 250 word statement that you can make. Getting the word out into the news is really important. And you can reach out to me directly. It's amandafox.ari@gmail.com if you want to help out. Or if you can't remember that, we're also on Facebook, so you can just directly message our Facebook. And I also want to stress the importance that even if you don't think that you are experienced enough to get a bill all the way through the legislature, just getting it introduced, just getting the sponsor is enough to have it just advertised on so many news outlets. Our one bill was on the news so many times, and we were represented for the octopus so many times across major news outlets that just the introduction was really impactful. So we really want to ask everyone to get involved if they can. And thank you, Julia, for the invitation, and everyone for the ability to speak.
Well, thank you, Amanda. I don't know how you managed to condense in a nutshell, basically a package of lobby practical tips. So really, thank you for that. I think this will be very, very useful. I mean, it sounded very accessible to me. The work you're doing, with this focus on octopus and in the US is honestly admirable. And as you know, we are obviously here to keep supporting all these efforts and, yeah, like you said, engaging with these legislators as often as possible. Just to follow up on Amanda's call to action, obviously feel free to reach out to her directly, or if you want, we will for sure convey all this information through our newsletters or through the aquatic animal policy focus group. So like Amanda was saying, there's plenty of ways you can get involved, and one additional voice is always helpful. And sorry for taking a little bit more time on this, but I have a soft spot for our octopus campaign ban, so I felt that was needed. Okay, let me turn this to our next speaker. So Sagar, please take the floor.
Thanks so much for the introduction. And yeah, it is a real pleasure to speak at this conference and be on this panel. So I'm Sagar Shah. I work in the animal welfare department of a think tank called Rethink Priorities. We do research to help identify high impact ways to improve the lives of animals. And in 2023, we've had an increasing focus on aquatic animals. I've personally been working on a research project examining the potential for corporate commitments by grocers in Europe to improve the welfare of farmed finfish. And so my remarks today, I'd like to share some of our insights on identifying where to focus attention on. So I plan to cover three things: why we selected this research project, give you a bit of background on that, walk you through some metrics related to farmed fish consumption in Europe, and highlight the countries and species where we see a lot of potential if this work is successful. So why corporate commitments to improve farmed fish welfare in Europe? There are three main reasons. First, voluntary corporate commitments from grocers and food service businesses are recognised as being successful in getting lots of layer hens out of cages. We wanted to explore the potential for similar success for farmed fish, and Europe seemed like a very good starting place to explore this work. Second, we viewed voluntary corporate commitments as valuable to pursue, given the uncertainty over if and when we might secure policy protections for farmed fish and the scope limitations of any such protections. A specific example of this, of the advantages of corporate commitments, is imports. So if we do end up securing EU-wide welfare protections for farmed fish, it's very likely they'll apply only to production within the EU and not imports, at least in the near term. But if a grocer were to make a fish welfare commitment, it can also apply to imported fish. Now, before I dive into the data and give you a preview, I wanted to give you a preview of the results. So as far as European consumption is concerned, there are 3 species: gilt-head sea bream, European sea bass, and rainbow trout, particularly the small size variety. These are all farmed fish that stand out as worthy of greater attention from a welfare perspective. And consumption of these fish looks disproportionately high in Italy, Spain, and France. So securing commitments from grocers in these countries can be particularly impactful. So I'm going to take you through some charts and dive into the data. So if you wanted to see how many fish you might be able to affect through grocery welfare commitments, consumption data is a natural starting place. And as Claudia mentioned, if you look by weight, Atlantic salmon seems to be the most consumed farmed fish species in Europe by a very long margin. The EU consumed over 1 million metric tons in 2021. That's more than the other named species combined. My own anecdotal experience is that Atlantic salmon is the farmed fish species that gains the most attention from advocates, at least in the West. But if you're concerned about improving the welfare of farmed fish, other metrics might be more important for identifying where we should focus on. And today I'm going to present on some of these, including the number of individual fish consumed, the amount of time they spend in captivity on farms, proxies for existing welfare protections for these fish, and concentrations in consumption across different countries. So first up is the number of fish consumed. This chart provides estimates of the number of individual farmed finfish slaughtered in order to support consumption in the EU 27 in 2021. The solid green bars show my best guess, and the error bars give a sense of the uncertainty. My best guess is that EU households consume more individual sea bream, sea bass, and small rainbow trout than they do Atlantic salmon. And this is mainly a function of fish size. Atlantic salmon typically have a much higher harvest weight than sea bream, sea bass, and small size rainbow trout. Next up is time on farms. And this chart shows the estimated aggregate time in the captivity for fish that survive long enough to make it onto the dinner plates of EU households. And on this metric, gilt-head sea bream looks to be similar to Atlantic salmon, with around 500 million animal years of time spent on farms to meet EU consumption of each species in 2021. Sea bass and small rainbow trout look lower, but higher than for other species. Next, welfare conditions. Now, these are quite hard to quantify, and there have been some questions coming up reflecting that. But I think this chart, which shows the share of EU farms that stun fish before slaughter, is a reasonable proxy of existing welfare protections or historical efforts to improve the welfare of various species. And although the data is for EU production only, I think it's a reasonable reflection of imported production too. So almost all farmed salmon in the EU consumed in the EU is stunned before slaughter, including imports from Norway and Scotland. It's estimated that about between 20% to 50% of EU trout producers stun their fish before slaughter. These producers account for the majority of EU trout consumption. Fewer than 5% of EU sea bream and sea bass are reported to stun their fish. And I think the proportion is actually quite similar for imports, much of which come from nearby Turkey. And the final metric I wanted to show is consumption concentration. Specifically, are there any particular countries or markets that consume a disproportionate amount of the most numerate fish with the least protections? And this chart shows the share of EU consumption of various species that France, Italy, and Spain account for. These countries account for just over a third of the EU population, but based on my calculations, it looks like they account for over half of the EU consumption of sea bream and sea bass, and over 40% of small rainbow trout. So I've shown a lot of data in my short remarks. What would I suggest the key takeaways are? First, I think it's useful to use data to help identify where we might want to prioritize our efforts, such as the most numerous species that benefit from the least protections. Second, I think there's a potential for fish welfare commitments from major grocers in France, Spain, and Italy to benefit a large number of finfish. And it's great that there is a Mediterranean collaboration working on this type of work. I think it'd be really great to see grocers in these countries recognise fish welfare and report on fish welfare metrics, as some grocers in Germany and the UK have started to do. But of course, identifying promising areas to focus on is much easier than actually achieving change. And there are many more factors that will determine how feasible such efforts will be, and lots of challenges in implementation. Too many to list in this short presentation. I did want to highlight that we Rethink Priorities are doing some research on this space, including how cost-effective such efforts could be. So please look out for a report when it comes out, or do get in touch. And my email address is on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sagar, also for condensing as well all this data and metrics and analysis in one short presentation. I highly encourage all of you to dive into the reports at Rethink, because yeah, metrics and numbers can definitely positively influence our decisions and strategies. There's already like some interesting questions for you on the metric side, but as said before, let us go through all the presentation. I'm curious to see what you will answer to those. Okay, so let's move on. Jane, I'd like to pass the floor to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you once again for inviting me to be part of this conference. It's really interesting to hear from everybody and to be able to present to you today. I've been asked to give a bit of a whistle-stop overview of our benchmark project that we launched last year, which focuses on decapod crustaceans. So just to give a brief bit of background, Crustacean Compassion was founded in 2016 with the aim of working for the legal protection and humane treatment of decapod crustaceans, including crabs, lobsters, nephrops and prawns, and in the food supply chain and beyond. And decapod crustaceans were recognised as sentient animals in the UK's Animal Welfare Sentience Act in 2022. However, despite the legal recognition of their ability to feel pain and distress, they are still not protected from unnecessary suffering by the Animal Welfare Act. As Lorenzo touched on earlier, he mentioned just a few of the inhumane working practices that decapods are still subjected to in very large numbers. Without legislation in place to enforce the humane treatment of these animals, around 5 billion of which are landed in or imported to the UK every year, we knew that working directly with food businesses was going to be an essential pillar of our campaign to try and reduce this suffering. And last year, it became clear that greater transparency would be needed to inform consumers about seafood companies' approach to decapod welfare, and a transparency which was broadly lacking at that time. And without that information, we wouldn't be able to understand how the issue is currently managed in the UK, or be able to monitor progress, highlight areas for improvement, or celebrate any positive change and progress that was being made. So we identified the need for a new benchmark project that would capture this baseline of information and also help to define welfare expectations for companies going forward. It would also give us a tool to support our corporate engagement work, with a framework of practical recommendations that we could use to base ongoing discussions on, and to help businesses see a pathway towards higher welfare and how that would look for their operation. And as part of those conversations, it would also offer opportunities for businesses to contribute insights about any challenges or knowledge gaps that they may be facing as they try to address decapod welfare. The 30 companies assessed in the benchmark all include all the major UK supermarkets, and the rest we chose based on a combination of their impact and or influence within the decapod supply chain and their consumer profile, and also their level of innovation, as was known at the time, in terms of their approach to welfare. Following a public consultation last summer, which listed the views of major companies, organisations and individuals within the seafood industry, we made two important modifications to our original plan based on those conversations. One was to not publicly share the company's scores, and the second was to allow the consideration of unpublished information that was not yet in the public domain. But both of those conditions would be in place for the first year only. And these decisions reflected the fact that, officially speaking, this was a relatively new animal welfare issue. And we also acknowledged that reality with the weighting of the scoring system. So nearly half the points could be earned in the management, commitment and policy section, as we expected many companies to be in the early stages of this process, with the performance impact and reporting section having much less weight at this time. So the first report for 2022, Snapshot 2022, was publicly launched in January this year, and we were able to give anonymised aggregated scores and findings from across the assessments. It provided us with this baseline from which we can evaluate improvements in the second year. So it was important to get the questions right in order to give us the most comprehensive picture of decapod welfare standards. Some key figures to pluck from this report include the fact that individual company scores ranged from 0% to 69%. That was based on a combination of published and unpublished information where available. The average score across all 30 companies was 20%. Retailers were on average performing better than producers and processors, but producers and processors were marginally ahead in the innovation and leadership areas. We're now into the second year of the snapshot, and we're at the stage in the cycle where companies have received their final scores, and we're putting together the 2023 report, which we launched early next year. And company scores and rankings will be shared publicly for the first time in that report. We have engaged with companies regularly throughout the cycle, inviting them to provide feedback on their reports and to meet with us to discuss ways to improve and also any concerns or challenges they may have. Engagement was good in the first year, with a large proportion of benchmark companies actively engaging with us, and we're continuing to see further improvements to that rate of engagement this year. Unfortunately, I can't share any of the 2023 scores with you just yet because the report hasn't been put together and released, but at that time we'll be able to talk in more detail about the progress that's being made. But I can say, based on our work so far, that we have seen some significant increases in some companies' scores and their policy commitments, some in excess of 50% of the available total score. And that's comparing published information only this year to what in many cases was a combination of public and unpublished data in the first year. However, there do remain some companies that have made no progress since last year, and it's hoped that the combination of public pressure and competitive forces that start to emerge from this issue will encourage those companies that are not yet addressing decapod welfare to move more swiftly in the coming months and years. I'm sure people have questions about the challenges that we faced in setting up and implementing a new benchmark. One major consideration was a fear by the industry that companies would be named and shamed over their decapod standards, or lack of them as it may stand, when they were still not legally compelled to reach a certain standard or even follow the informal guidance that existed in the industry. This was highly likely to provoke a degree of hostility and suspicion among the industry, perhaps manifesting a lack of willingness to engage with the benchmark or with us as an organisation. By providing a grace period of a year when company scores wouldn't be publicly shared, we felt we demonstrated a good faith attitude towards companies that were in many cases not unwilling to make those changes, but were scrutinising this issue for the very first time, and were at the very early stages of recognising and exploring their policies on this. Allowing them to provide non-published policy and sourcing information in confidence if they wanted to also enabled us to get a fuller picture of the company's activities and allowed more time for them to understand the assessment criteria and formalise and publish their decapod welfare positions. So a first year report that talked in more overarching terms about the industry would, we felt, mitigate the PR impact on individual companies, and that also helped us to establish goodwill and more cooperation than we might otherwise have gained. Another challenge was that as an NGO proposing to benchmark the industry, we knew we were likely to be questioned about our credibility and authority to undertake this task. This was addressed by making it clear that our welfare positions as an organisation are not based on emotion or assumptions, but on the latest scientific evidence, much of which was featured in the LSE review that Lorenzo mentioned earlier, that informed the government's decision to include decapods in the Sentience Act in the UK. And as part of the credibility piece, we worked with renowned consultants Kronos Sustainability, who are the company behind established food benchmark BD4, to develop the snapshot and then to carry out the company assessments independently. Another major question we knew we'd face is regarding the current ongoing project by the industry to develop new codes of practice for decapod crustacean welfare. We were pleased to be invited to provide input via the welfare panel for this project, which is due hopefully to be completed by the end of the year. However, the sentience of decapods was legally recognised 18 months ago, and it's clear that reform is urgently required to stop the unnecessary suffering of billions of animals every year. Our understanding is that the industry codes of practice will not address every harmful practice across the entire supply chain. And also we knew that some companies had already made some independent strides towards higher welfare policies for some decapod species, while the industry codes of practice is likely to give some focus to economic feasibility for businesses and perhaps weight that more heavily than achieving the optimal welfare outcomes for decapods. But when the industry codes of practice are launched, we see the snapshot operating as a complementary tool that can, if appropriate, incorporate the codes of practice too. And we've also published our own codes of practice that provide a strong starting point for higher decapod welfare, which we hope can be incorporated into the industry's own guidance. We see the snapshot as a tool not only for improving transparency and measuring industry's progress, but also for supporting businesses that want to improve and to share the commercial success stories that will then pressure the whole industry to follow suit and aim for the highest possible standards of decapod welfare. To close, I'd just like to mention that this year we've launched the Crustacean Industry Welfare Hub, which is another tool to support businesses in understanding and addressing decapod welfare requirements. It's a free members-only website for people working in the seafood industry and associated fields, where they can find information and resources on the science behind decapod sentience, on welfare recommendations, industry news, legislation news, and many more areas. And this is part of our endeavour to build and maintain a constructive and collaborative relationship with the industry that can have a meaningful impact on the lives of decapods in the UK supply chain. We've also published a Sea to Plate welfare report, which outlines the welfare threats that decapod crustaceans face at every stage of the supply chain. And both this report and our codes of practice can be found on the Crustacean Industry Welfare Hub. And through the snapshot and our codes of practice, we're trying to demonstrate that we understand the need for a clear vision of what better welfare means. I think the snapshot has shown that there is a will among seafood companies to make those positive changes, but we will also continue alongside those to work to build support with other audiences that can influence the industry, including consumers and politicians who can enshrine this protection for decapods into law. So that's all for me, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jane, for your presentation. I totally support the importance of benchmarks, and such tools in order to, well, drive, change and influence all these actors that we were saying are just important to have in our conversations. And I also want to highlight, I particularly liked how you flagged that basically your efforts when it comes to benchmark or the analysis you make are rooted in scientific evidence, because I think a lot of times NGOs are just thought to produce their reports on emotions, which for sure compassion, I think it's a big trait that advocates have, but scientific evidence is the powerful tool that we need to use to bring tangible changes on legislative levels. So thank you for flagging that as well. Okay, we have our very last but not least panelist of today. So my wonderful colleague Cecilia, and she will talk to us about Aquatic Life Institute corporate initiative. So Ceci, over to you.
Thank you, Julia. Let me try to share my screen. And please let me know if this works properly. Can you see it?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. And also, please let me know if the slides are changing. Okay, so for the ones who don't know me yet, I'm Cecilia, and I lead the corporate initiative here with the Aquatic Life Institute. This is our newest area of work. This program was launched earlier this year, and I'm delighted to be here today having this opportunity to talk about why animal welfare is good for business. I've been helping corporations to improve their animal welfare policies over the past 6 years. And we all know how urgent this conversation has become as our food system is facing a lot of challenges related to lack of transparency and also some severe consequences, both to human health and the environment. So by incorporating animal welfare into their business strategy, corporations can actually be part of the solution and help to transform our food system into a more just and sustainable one. So today we're going to see how we can get there. In these past years, and I think especially after the pandemic, we are seeing that consumers have become much more concerned about the origin and the impact of all their choices, seeking for ethical and sustainable products and prioritizing brands that are committed to responsible practices and many times share the same values as they do. And in this scenario, animal welfare has emerged as a crucial aspect of sustainability. And this is actually a great opportunity for corporations, as this change in consumers' behavior has prompted business to reevaluate their practices and to build trust and foster credibility. So addressing animal welfare is not just about doing the right thing, being responsible or ethical. It actually can help business to flourish in different ways. And one of them is making progress towards the SDGs. Here we have some examples of how animal welfare can bring positive outcomes related to some of these goals, including, for example, no poverty, zero hunger, climate action, and some others that we have listed here. So in general terms, animal welfare helps boost productivity, which could lead to more jobs and income, improving economic conditions. Increasing animal welfare also makes animals grow healthier, which means more nutritious food. And in the other hand, high animal welfare practices also help to reduce diseases and infections, which leads to less use of antibiotics and also reduce emissions, as it means more efficient feeding, saving energy, and keeping pollution low. High animal welfare also helps to minimize pollution from excess feed, waste, chemicals, and plastic, both in aquaculture and fisheries. And also in terms of safer work environments, animal welfare requires employees to be trained, develop new skills and knowledge, which empower these professionals to secure decent work and contribute to economic growth. And of course, it allows consumers to make more informed decisions. So to support large-scale buyers in integrating animal welfare into their supply chain, Aquatic Life Institute has introduced the corporate initiative earlier this year. And through this program, what we do is we offer tailored consultancy to corporations, which is completely free of charge. And we actually collaborate very closely with these companies to conduct deep evaluations, identify improvements, and set up feasible targets that are actually aligned with the company's values and sustainability goals. And our role actually goes beyond policy review. We also assist corporations to communicate effectively these objectives and commitments to both internal and external stakeholders. We support companies to develop implementation plans to integrate animal welfare in their supply chains. And also together with the company, we establish accountability processes that will help to track progress, identify achievements, and address challenges that may come up. So let's see why it's a smart move to address animal welfare before it becomes a must-do in terms of legislation or before a company faces some kind of image damage related to poor animal welfare practices. So first of all, comprehensive animal welfare policies usually help to attract and retain customers as they create better public image, trust, brand loyalty, and many times also lead to positive media coverage. And we also see that companies that have a progressive approach and take the lead can set their business apart from competitors, securing, for example, more market share. And apart from that, being ahead and proactively addressing animal welfare also reduces legal risks or potential regulatory challenges. And of course, it minimizes potential reputational damage or disruptions due to protests or boycotts, for example. In terms of savings, it can reduce operation costs by increasing production, efficiency, and reducing risk of diseases outbreaks, for example. And finally, we know that investing in animal welfare is somehow like having your passport ready for international business. And for sure, it's also something that attracts investors. So the message here is for companies, don't wait until it's too late. Let's just make sure that we stay ahead. Well, so, I mean, we covered a lot of ground today on how to make a real difference in aquatic animal welfare, but sometimes it's hard to know exactly where to start. So I brought here some initiatives that we've been encouraging companies to do. So first of all, it all begins with policy language. So if the company already has any kind of seafood sourcing or procurement policy, just making sure that it covers not only potential environment issues, but also aquatic animal welfare. Another important step is commit to having all the seafood in the supply chain being certified by a credible certification scheme. And this obviously can be done and implemented in a future deadline. Other crucial action in terms of reputation is banning controversial practices from their supply chains. So, for example, we can mention eye stalk ablation for shrimps or farmed octopus products if they ever become available in the market. And in fact, we are seeing some certification schemes already stating publicly that they will not approve both of these practices and neither the use of insects for feed. And to mention some examples from the corporate sector, we have recently encouraged and supported two major UK retailers, which are M&S and Waitrose, in releasing their crustacean and decapod welfare policies, and both of them stated banning eye stalk ablation from their supply chains. And finally, we are offering companies the opportunity to engage in some kind of pilot project with technology companies and producers to test new promising technologies, for example, like studying methods. Before I wrap up, I just wanted to take a moment here for us to reflect on everything that has been said here. I think that it's important that we keep in mind that animal welfare is not just a buzzword or a checkbox. It's actually a journey, an opportunity, and a moral obligation. And championing aquatic animal welfare makes business more sustainable, more ethical, and for sure it can contribute to a brighter and more compassionate future for our planet. So let's keep in mind that every action creates change, and even small steps that we take today can inspire others and can create a powerful wave of transformation. So let's not be the observers, let's be the change makers and create a legacy that not only benefits business, but also leaves a profound impact in the world that we shared. So Aquatic Life Institute is here to be an ally, a guide, and a partner. And we believe that together we can make the world's ocean safer, its ecosystem healthier, and its animal protected. Thank you all for joining us today. I leave here my contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I'll be more than happy to connect and explore any opportunities of collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ceci, for your presentation and for finishing up with such a beautiful thought. And I think you perfectly summarized what all the other panelists sort of touched upon throughout their presentations, you know, the importance of, involving active actors in the sector into the conversation. I always stress this because I know it's difficult, and especially when it comes to aquatic animals, but is absolutely fundamental. There's no way we can even address issues for aquatic animals by ourselves. So thank you. That was a very beautiful way to close the presentation, and a perfect way to transition into Q&As. So we have about 10 minutes, should be just enough to go through some of the questions we received. So let me just start straight away. This first question was asked during your presentation, Krzysztof, but I'm sure others can jump in as well. So the question is, do the guidelines you referred to only cover fish, or do they include shrimp as well? Is there anything we can refer to for shrimp welfare in terms of certification guidelines? Before you answer, Krzysztof, I'm sure maybe Lorenzo or others can jump in as well if they want. I also want to mention Tessa, my colleague, is here on the call. She's also part of the ASC technical working group for the development of their shrimp welfare module. So Tessa, maybe I'll also ask you to jump in if needed. Krzysztof, if you want to get started.
Right. Well, yes, I'll get started and then let Lorenzo, Jane, and Tessa to take this over, because I think you probably have more to add. EU specifically, the focus, or at least the guidelines, we managed to sort of push through our own fish. The best opening, I guess, in terms of EU policy is the ESA opinion on crustaceans and cephalopods, but that's scheduled only for 2030. So quite a bit of a waiting time to wait for those, and those will be just sort of a scientific opinion to inform what could come out of it. But there is definitely more happening on the certification front with the ASC going through their shrimp standard recently, and much more endeavor. I think it's more interesting on that side. So yeah, maybe give floor to people who are working on crustaceans more at the moment.
Please feel free to jump in, Lorenzo, Jane, Tessa, whatever.
I was just going to
say what Krzysztof already said actually about the ASC currently consulting on their new shrimp welfare standard, which would be a bolt-on to the universal farm standard, which we were fortunate to be on the technical working group for. I just would like to say actually one thing that we hear a lot in conversations with industry, and it was discussed quite broadly at the Global Shrimp Forum in September as well, is that companies appear to have a desire for more certification schemes to take a more active role in welfare and applying welfare standards, because it would help them to be able to normalize welfare instead of having to perhaps have suppliers or buyers dealing with bespoke sourcing requirements for each sort of individual supply chain. So it would be encouraging to see more certification schemes taking up welfare standards, welfare indicators across all decapod crustacean species.
Yeah, I can add something. A few months ago, when we started the project here in Ali, we were thinking about investigating the potential for certification. So we got in touch with the ASC as well as MSC. But the results were quite different. I think for aquaculture, it's obviously it's not easy, but it's much more straightforward than it is for fisheries. For fisheries, there is a lot of tradition, I feel, attached to what they're doing. It's much more difficult to delve deeper and to understand what's going on. There are many more species as compared to aquaculture. There are being caught, which makes it much harder to implement some sort of certification schemes for fisheries. For aquaculture, however, as we see from ASC, the situation is different, and it's possible to add more species, and it's been done every year. But yeah, I just wanted to point out this dichotomy, this difference between the fisheries and aquaculture. It's just hard to penetrate to break into the fisheries realm and try to change things.
Yeah, thank you all for your insights. It's clear that more efforts and more work are clearly helpful in this space. I just want to move on to the next questions. One I feel that has been answered during Amanda's presentation, like asking, what can we do for octopus farming? But we can get back to that if we have a little bit more time. So Sagar, I mentioned that I have a question probably directed to you, I think for maybe Jane as well. So each company in the aquaculture industry has its own metrics to assess animal welfare in corporate social responsibility reports, creating non-standardized quantitative and qualitative metrics. Do you think clearer generic metrics will be developed in the future at EU level, and how?
Thanks. I'm probably going to caveat my response in saying that I am not the expert on EU policy, so may defer a bit to Krzysztof on this. But I think whether or not we will end up seeing like clearer generic metrics at the EU level depends on whether we secure improvements for farm fish at the EU level, and then how they are implemented. So if we were to secure, say, a requirement to stun fish before slaughter, which hopefully will be on the table for the next commission, I can envisage a world where there would be a requirement to report on the share that are stunned, and maybe by the method, especially for species where there's going to be a long implementation period. But I think whether you can get metrics at a EU level depends on the level of implementation and the degree that implementation is left to individual member states versus being set out more centrally. But Krzysztof, you may have more to add on the metric side of things.
I don't think I do, actually. I think you summed it up pretty well, and I think that's one of the situation where it's sort of policy and business or corporate work coming sort of together, because as you said, on the one hand, it depends on sort of what legislation we get, if we get it. On the other hand, the more sort of industry can show they're ready to take it, and the more progressive stance we have on the industry side, and we can prove to the decision makers, there is a big part of business that can follow up with, let's say, humane slaughter methods, and they can report well, and they are doing it, then the more, the less sort of hesitant the legislators are to say, oh no, this is too complicated, we cannot put very specific metrics and so on. But yeah, it's a big unknown at the moment, so I don't think I have specific insight.
Yeah, I would agree with Krzysztof there. I mean, again, I can't speak to the EU, but I think certainly in this country, we may well find that among retailers in particular, their own demand for and requirement for reporting and certain metrics on, in our line of work, decapod crustacean welfare, I think may outpace anything that's being requested by the government and even certification schemes. And as Krzysztof mentioned, showing that the industry has the capacity and will to start collecting this information themselves and almost sort of standardizing it amongst themselves, potentially partly through commercial competition, if we're honest about it. They want to be able to show that they are working on these issues. I think that may well lead legislators in a way in the long run.
Thank you for all your insight on this question. I'm just mindful of time, so I just want to go back to the question that was focusing on octopus farming. So Amanda, maybe I can squish two questions in one. So the original question was, do panelists, so this is for everyone actually, think any of the work on fish farming could be applicable to octopus as well? Would advocacy efforts aiming to ban octopus farming before it gets off the ground benefit from synergies with fish welfare victories? I'm just gonna say, Amanda very rightfully mentioned gathering, existing legislation to help introduce different initiatives. So Amanda, anything you wanna comment on that? But maybe I will link another question. If you think that there are other states in the US that maybe you think or you feel would be more open for an introduction on a potential bill on octopus farming. So maybe we can touch on both questions.
Yeah, okay, great. So yes, of course, well, I definitely think that implementing legislation before is really important and really accessible and easy for the policymakers to consider, because it's not going to put anyone out of business. I feel like in other industries, they're hesitant to really impact anyone that already has an established business, but because this won't impact anyone as of yet, they've all been very interested so far. And other United States that would be really good for this bill would definitely be California and Oregon, and other coastal states. So on the East Coast as well, I can see probably Massachusetts and states near there. So, yeah, so if anyone wanted our help with that, like to use the legislation or to connect with us about the other states, I would be really happy to work with anyone specifically on the states. I could also help in other countries, but I'm just more familiar with how the United States legislative system works.
Thank you, Amanda. And absolutely, actually, I think what you're saying also is a partial answer to this question. So if you don't know where to start in your country, maybe because there is not a precedent already existing, lean on external NGOs who might have already started these efforts, even in other countries. It's still a very useful resource. That's what I did when I started, basically reaching out to all the folks effectively operating in other countries to have an idea, a basis of where to start from. So that would be, sorry, my personal addition to your answer. Okay. So Sagar, we have another question about the metrics. So they thank you for the talk. They said it was really interesting to hear about different metrics you discussed. Could you give an insight or example of how you use the weighting of the various metrics to make decisions?
Thanks. So in this particular project, I say not done a formal weighting between them, so sort of measured scale, looked at neglectedness and identified the sort of species and countries which felt like the most important important places to focus on. But I can give an example of a time where we do consider other metrics. So sometimes we will, when thinking about different welfare threats facing animals, we might use what we call as a prevalence, intensity, duration framework. So thinking about how many animals might be affected by a particular welfare issue, maybe come up with numbers on how intense the suffering might be, and then make judgments about the duration, so how long a welfare issue might affect or cause suffering for. And in this case, we multiply them together, so it's almost like giving them equal weight, and that can give some results that I think going in may not be intuitive. So I'll give an example of one. So when I first heard about ice stalk ablation for shrimp, had a very visceral or sort of a reaction to how awful it sounds, and it is awful. But then when you consider the prevalence element, so how many broodstock are affected compared to the number of shrimp that are in farming systems, it's actually quite a small proportion compared to shrimp that are farmed in totality. And so if you were to add these metrics together, it seems like addressing it may be less impactful than something that affects more shrimp for longer duration, even though it's very high intensity. So yeah, and sort of with one of my colleagues, Hannah and Will, have done some work looking at various welfare threats affecting shrimp, and I found the results very interesting, and they changed my mind about a couple of things. So yeah, an example of where insights can be very useful.
Yeah, thank you. I also discovered the importance and the usefulness of numbers, but I admit it's not always easy to interpret them. So, you know, for example, work that Rethink does, I feel it's like making numbers accessible to folks like me so that they can direct this their strategy and decisions. So, yeah, thank you for that. Let me go with a question for Jane. They asked for a little bit more information. I don't know how in depth you can go here, but may just briefly touch base. They ask the snapshot scores, what are the snapshot scores based on, and what are the criteria?
Yes, well, if you'd like to join the Crustacean Industry Welfare Hub, you can download the Snapshot 2022 report document, which does feature the entire assessment criteria and scoring system, and quite a detailed methodology, which will give full information about how we devised and operate the benchmark. But just very briefly, it's made up of 22 assessment criteria, which are divided into 4 scoring categories, and it covers everything from capture or harvest through to slaughter, with a particular focus on sort of key welfare issues, including humane slaughter, where we have an emphasis on the adoption of electrical stunning as one example of wanting to see companies moving towards more humane and sort of best practice methods. It's the weighting of the scoring is put more heavily on the first section, which is management, commitment and policy, because we do understand that a lot of companies are sort of very early on in this process of addressing decapod welfare, but it does cover everything right through to do they set targets, do they report on those targets, and are they keeping their customers and consumers up to date on how they're achieving their objectives, the proportion of decapods in their supply chain that are for example, transported within certain times, if they're transported live, what proportion of them are humanely stunned and slaughtered, etc. And also looking at, are their commitment policies essentially honoured, and can we see a very visible system for making sure that any commitments are enshrined in their in their supplier contracts, etc.? Do they have responsibility for welfare allocated to particular people within their team? Are their staff trained? How are they educating suppliers, etc.? So it's a fairly comprehensive overview of how companies are managing their working practices and also their supply chain, to try and get a picture of how the decapod sort of life cycle from capture onwards is being addressed by UK industry, basically. So that's just a very short answer. Let's say if you'd like to download the report, you will find the full criteria and methodology in there for you to peruse at your leisure.
Thanks, Jane, for summarizing everything in a short answer. I also highly encourage to check out the different details and characteristic of the snapshot. I think I found them really interesting and valuable. So I only have time for one last question. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of the questions that were asked. We'll do our best to get back to all of you. If you have some specific questions that were not answered, you can reach out directly to these panelists or reach out to Aquatic Life Institute, and we will be happy to redirect them. So just a general question, I would like for Claudia and Cecilia also maybe to try and answer this one. It's general, but I really like it. So it says, in countries where a lot of work still needs to be done in general regarding animal welfare, how can the welfare of aquatic animals and these policies be given more focus, as there are a lot of stakeholders to go through and a lot of work to be done? I understand it's not an easy question, but I'm particularly interested, Claudia, in your answer, because I know you guys like focus on Spain, but also keep an eye on like what's happening on a global level. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Julia. It's actually indeed a tricky question, but I was looking at the chat and thinking, I wish I had the chance of answering. And I can give you a good example. A few months ago, we began collaborating with One Health and Development Initiative. They are an animal welfare organization operating in Nigeria. And I know they already asked for your help to the Aquatic Life Institute too. So they've been developing a manual for farm fish welfare staff. And it's incredible the work they've been able to do up until this point. They also have plans to launch a platform to have there some training for the fish farm staff. And basically, I'm using the example in Nigeria, but I can also give you the example here in Spain, even though you may consider Spain or other EU states as developed countries. I can tell you in terms of fish welfare, we have many things to improve. We are a way long path ahead of us. So yes, we may have, for instance, here in Europe, some framework, very fragile, which helps us somehow to go through the things we need to go. But maybe in other countries like Nigeria, they don't have that framework. But at the end of the day, if there are some organizations trying to do something, if they have contacts in some ministry or within different departments in the public administration, if they are able to raise awareness and to be sure that fish welfare is included in the political agenda. We know we are asking for very big things, but the approach we had up until this point in Equalia was to take very small steps towards, a common goal, towards the right direction, and we know we'll get there. When, we don't know. I'm afraid I don't have an answer, but hopefully in the future, someday we'll be able to be there. And also, if you want, I can share here in the chat the link of that organization in case someone wishes to reach out to them.
Thank you, Claudia, and yes, please do. It was perfect actually to then end sort of this discussion with your answer. Again, for the sake of time, I wish I had the time to let other panelists continue engaging in this discussion. But for sure, as I mentioned before, feel free to send us your questions, and we will do our best to get them answered. So I just want to thank all the panelists and all the audience really for joining. This has been very interesting and actually went very quick panel. Just a comment on my part, I love to see that sort of what used to be maybe a neglected species, but even like neglected category of animals, like aquatic animals, are now becoming the center of attention for different stakeholders in policy space, industry space, NGO space. So I'm really happy to see that, and I hope that is a feeling that I can share with all of you. Okay, so we have our panel, the next panel that is starting in just 1 minute. So again, thank you all for joining us. And yes, we'll continue the conversation in our next session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.